Against the fury of a bomb cyclone, a pregnant German shepherd fought onward, her body savaged by a predator, her will the only thing left. By all accounts, the frozen wilderness should have claimed her hours ago. But shelter wasn't her mission. She was searching for a soldier. Then, a door creaked open, framing a scarred Marine, a weapon held ready in his hand. Yet she held her ground. Her gaze locked with his for a fleeting moment before she surrendered to exhaustion, placing her last hope, her unborn pups, in his hands. Two scarred veterans, each believing their battles were long past, were about to discover that the greatest fight for survival had just begun. The events that unfold within that remote cabin are a testament to love, being the ultimate shield. Before we tell the tale of winter's last warrior, let me know where you're joining us from. Share your country in the comments. And if you agree that every hero needs a sanctuary, be sure to subscribe, because this story of an improbable miracle is the very thing your soul has been waiting for. In Blackwood Pines, Oregon, winter didn't just arrive, it laid siege. It descended from the northern peaks like an invading force, blanketing the small timber town under a crushing shroud of white silence. From the isolated cabin clinging to the high ridge, the town was a mere scattering of faint yellow lights far below, gasping for air against the encroaching gray dusk. Here the wind was a palpable force, relentlessly pressing against the cabin's timber frame, probing the shelter's resilience just as haunting memories tested the very foundation of the man who dwelled within. Elias Thorne was awake long before dawn, his body still captive to the unyielding cadence of a life he'd abandoned years before. He swung his legs over the side of the Spartan bed, the old floorboards groaning in protest beneath his heavy frame. Elias Thorne, a 42-year-old Marine veteran, possessed a formidable build that looked as if it were hewn from solid granite. Yet his posture was burdened by an unseen exhaustion. His face was a rugged, weather-worn map of his past, etched with a jagged scar that traced a path from his left temple down to the hard line of his jaw. His hair, short and military cut, was flecked with gray, and his intense, storm-colored eyes were perpetually scanning for some unseen threat as he raked calloused hands over his face, feeling the ghost of an ache in his left leg, a phantom pain from an IED in Fallujah, an injury doctors claimed was healed, but which he knew would never truly leave him. But the memories were etched into his very nerves. He rose, his motions rigid yet deliberate, and moved toward the small kitchen. The cabin felt stripped bare, clean to the point of being sterile. Devoid of clutter, free of dust, it held no trace of a life being lived. This wasn't a home. It was a holdout, a forward base for a war that had officially ended 10 years ago. He began the morning ritual. It was the one thing that tethered him to the now. He ground the coffee beans manually, the harsh mechanical rasp, the only sound to break the crushing silence. He brought the water to a boil. He poured the dark, fragrant liquid into 2 ceramic mugs. One mug bore a chip on its rim, a relic from a diner in San Diego, a place where he and Clara had shared pancakes at 3 o'clock in the morning before his 3rd deployment. He carried the mugs to the small waiting table near the window. He set one down before the empty chair. Upon the table rested a small memorial, though Elias would never name it so. A silver star medal. Its ribbon faintly faded with time lay beside a framed photograph. Inside the frame was Clara Thorne, a woman with eyes that held deep laughter, her features caught in a fleeting moment of pure joy. Her hair was swept back by a phantom wind standing in a field of wildflowers. "Morning, Clara." Elias whispered, his voice a gravelly sound, long out of practice. "They're calling for heavy snow again." He settled into his own chair, cupping his large, scarred hands around the warmth of his mug, letting the heat penetrate his chilled fingers. He stared at the steam rising from her cup, imagining for one heart-stopping second that she had just set it down. But the vapor vanished just as she had, leaving behind only the stark, cold truth of the morning. A sudden soft thump, followed by the faintest scratching, shattered his reverie. Barnaby had leapt onto the table, weaving around the coffee mugs with an astonishing grace for a creature in his state. Barnaby was a large, grizzled tabby with matted orange fur and a missing left eye, the casualty of some long-forgotten battle. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait and possessed a single discerning green eye. The cat cautiously sniffed Clara's mug, then turned his gaze on Elias with a low, rumbling meow that was more accusation than greeting. "Don't even think about it," Elias warned, taking a slow sip of his own bitter coffee. "That one is hers." Barnaby huffed a soft sound of concession and settled onto the edge of the table. His lone eye was transfixed by the swirling snow beyond the window. Elias reached over, scratching the cat just behind the ears. Barnaby leaned into the comfort of his hand, a deep, rumbling purr starting in his chest that began to fill the heavy silence in the room. They were two wounded warriors, a man and his cat, holding their ground in a fortress of solitude. After his coffee, Elias crossed to the heavy oak desk in the corner. He opened a journal bound in worn leather. Its pages were not filled with notes on the majestic pines or the graceful deer that roamed the property. They held letters that would never see a mailbox. He took up a pen. The same hand, steady enough to hit a target from 500 yards, trembled now as the nib touched the paper. It wasn't a tremor of age. It was a glitch in his nervous system, a short circuit burned in by too many explosions and too much adrenaline. December 14th, he wrote, "Visibility is low. Perimeter is secure. But the silence, it's getting louder. I thought of Miller today. I remembered how he looked after the dust finally settled. I'm still here, Miller, and I don't know why." He stopped. The ink bled into the paper, blooming into a small, dark Rorschach test. He couldn't bring himself to finish. He snapped the book shut, the leather cover slapping down with a finality that echoed through the room. The writing was supposed to be a form of therapy, a way to exorcise the ghosts. Instead, it felt like he was summoning them. By late afternoon, the weather had shifted from aggressive to utterly violent. The wind began to shriek, a high-pitched, mournful sound that rattled the window panes. The temperature plummeted, turning the world outside into a churning canvas of white and gray. Elias checked the window seals and added another log to the stove. He was securing the perimeter. He was just reaching for a glass of whiskey to dull the evening ache when he heard it. It was not the wind. The wind was a chaotic, constant roar. This was rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. It stopped, and then started again. Thump, thump. Elias froze. His head tilted, his eyes narrowing into slits. That was not a branch striking the siding. It was deliberate. It sounded like a heavy fist or perhaps a body hitting the solid oak of the front door. Barnaby, who had been sleeping on the rug, shot to his feet, ears flattened against his skull, and a low guttural growl rumbled from his chest as he stared at the door. "Easy." Elias breathed his voice a low whisper as his body coiled into action. He didn't approach the door like some curious homeowner. This was different. He moved with a practiced, tactical grace. His hand slipped into the side table drawer, closing around the familiar weight of his Colt 1911. He racked the slide, confirming a round in the chamber before flicking the safety off with his thumb. Blackwood Pines was a world away, miles down the mountain. No one should be out here in a storm this vicious, not unless they were seeking refuge from the storm, or they were the storm. He hugged the wall, inching toward the door from the side. His back pressed against the cold logs. The sound came again, fainter, now more desperate. A thump, a scratch, another heavy thump. Elias drew a steadying breath, his knuckles white around the cold steel of his weapon. With his left hand, he slowly, deliberately turned the deadbolt. His right hand kept the firearm aimed and ready. He ripped the door open, bracing for whatever horror awaited a bear, an intruder, a phantom of the storm. The wind was the first to attack. A blinding wall of ice and snow slammed into him, stealing his sight for a moment. He squinted through the biting gale, his gaze dropping to the porch floor. No man stood before him. Instead, lying on his porch, nearly swallowed by a snowdrift pressed against the door, was a creature that seemed less an animal and more a fallen warrior defeated by a battle he couldn't see. The intruder Valkyrie, a large female German shepherd. Her magnificent coat was a tangled mess of ice and dark, wet blood. A shredded tactical collar hung like a broken promise around her neck. Each breath was a shallow, ragged fight, a faint plume of steam rising from her side. Elias slowly lowered the gun, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The dog didn't shrink away. Not a single whimper escaped her. With an effort that seemed to drain her final ounce of strength, she lifted her head. Her eyes found his and held them. They were startlingly intelligent, the color of amber and filled with a devastating clarity. This wasn't a plea for help. This was a soldier reporting for duty. She was passing on a mission, one she could no longer see through on her own. It was then Elias saw the crimson stain spreading on the snow beneath her. He saw the gentle swell of her belly. She was pregnant, grievously wounded, and freezing to death. "Stand down?" Elias whispered the words, escaping him like a prayer. The command was an instinct, a reflex from a lifelong past. The dog held his gaze for one beat longer, a silent confirmation that her message had been received. Then her head fell heavily to the snow. She collapsed, her body going completely limp across the threshold of his isolated sanctuary. In that moment, Elias didn't think. He didn't calculate the risks or consider the consequences. The blood staining his floor meant nothing. He slid the gun back into its holster and fell to his knees in the biting snow, gathering the animal's considerable weight into his arms. She was a dead weight, a profound burden, yet he lifted her with a raw grunt, hauling her from the chaos of the storm into the sanctuary of his cabin. With a heavy thud, his boot kicked the door shut, silencing the screaming wind. He gently laid her down on the rug before the hearth. Barnaby crept closer, his nose twitching at the scent of the intrusion. The war had finally crossed his threshold, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Elias Thorne didn't feel like he was facing it alone. The cabin's air, thick with wood smoke and old coffee, was soon consumed. Those familiar comforts were swallowed by the coppery tang of blood and the sharp, sterile sting of antiseptic. With a groan of effort, Elias had shoved the heavy oak coffee table clear across the room, creating an impromptu operating theater on the braided rug in the fire's glow. Outside, the storm had escalated, its winds battering the log walls with the force of an artillery barrage, but Elias heard none of it. His entire world had shrunk to the stark circle of light cast by a floor lamp he'd positioned over the still wounded creature, moving with a swiftness that defied his own aching leg. He tore off his flannel shirt, leaving him in a stark white undershirt, and scrubbed his hands raw at the kitchen sink with scalding water and abrasive soap. This was no sterile veterinary clinic, but he possessed something just as vital, a Marine's trauma kit. He retrieved the dusty olive-drab bag from the highest pantry shelf, a ghost of his past he'd tucked away years ago, but could never bring himself to discard. Inside, the contents were aged, but their seals were unbroken. Gauze pressure bandages, a suture kit holding curved needles, thick, heavy-duty thread, and a bottle of potent rubbing alcohol. Elias knelt beside the dog. Now out of the whiteout, the full, devastating scope of her injuries was laid bare. She was a magnificent German shepherd, her powerful build still evident beneath the sharp lines of ribs that told a story of prolonged starvation. But his gaze was drawn to her belly, swollen taut and hanging low. Life. A flicker of life was clinging on inside this dying animal. He laid a hand on her abdomen, a gesture of profound gentleness. Through the cold, damp fur, he felt it a tremor, a tiny kick, a pulse of life entirely separate from her own failing one. "Just hold on," he whispered, his voice a gravelly plea. He forced his focus to the wound on her flank. It was a brutal sight, a ragged tear about 4 inches long with mangled, uneven edges. This was no clean slice from a blade. It was a savage tear, Bear trap. Maybe the swipe of a cougar, Elias voiced into the stillness. His words were a fragile shield against the encroaching silence as he doused his hands and the needle with the stinging alcohol. The sharp scent hit him like a physical blow, throwing him back to a crowded tent in Kandahar, the air thick with dust and the haunting screams of men who were barely more than boys. His hands began to betray him. The tremor started in his thumb, a subtle twitch that spread like a poison up to his wrist. Not now, he commanded himself, his voice a harsh whisper. Lock it down. He sealed his eyes shut, inhaling a single deep breath that expanded his chest to its very limit and held the air captive. He counted to 4, then exhaled for 4 more. When his eyes opened again, the tremor was gone, supplanted by a cold, mechanical focus. The soldier's creed wasn't merely about honor, it was about function. You simply do the job until the job is finally done. You deal with the feeling later. He began to gently clean the wound. The dog moaned softly in her unconscious state, her back leg twitching from a distant pain. Barnaby, who had been a silent sentinel on the mantelpiece, suddenly decided his expert supervision was required closer to the heart of the matter. A one-eyed orange tabby cat of distinction, a solid 15 pounds of dense muscle and earned cynicism. He moved with a heavy, confident gait, his single green eye absorbing every detail. Most cats would have vanished at the scent of blood or the distress of a predator 10 times their size. Barnaby, however, was not most cats. He had survived the very fire that had taken his eye. He knew the landscape of pain intimately. He leapt down from the mantel, his paws making soft thuds as he crossed the rug. "Back off, Barnaby," Elias warned, his hands steady as he threaded the curved needle. "This isn't a spectator sport." Barnaby completely ignored him. The cat approached the large dog's head, delicately sniffing the matted, wet fur. Then he did something that made Elias pause mid-stitch, the needle held aloft. Barnaby deliberately curled his paws beneath his chest, settling into a perfect loaf right next to the dog's nose. He closed his single eye and began to purr. It was not a normal purr. It was a low-frequency rumble, a deep vibrating thrum that seemed to resonate right through the wooden floorboards beneath them. Elias could actually hear the distinct change in the dog's breathing as it deepened and grew even. The twitching in her legs stilled completely. The cat was acting as a living anchor. His purr was a biological lullaby, cutting through the animal's shock and trauma. "Well, I'll be damned," Elias whispered to the quiet room. "Good work, Private," he murmured, returning to his task. The hide was thick, yet Elias's hands remained unshaken. He sutured the gash with a grim focus, a chilling echo of mending uniforms, and on darker days, men. In, out, secure. In, out. Secure the knot. As he worked, he studied her face. A noble spirit shone through her exhaustion, etched into her very features. In the angle of her ears, the strength of her muzzle. She was far more than a stray. She was a warrior who had endured hell to reach this refuge. "You're no stray, are you?" Elias whispered, securing the final stitch with a gentle pull. "You're a true fighter." The name surfaced in his mind, a whisper from the old myths Clara once read aloud, of the ones who chose the slain. "Valkyrie," he murmured, feeling the name's power on his tongue. "That is who you are. Valkyrie." He gently cleansed the blood from the suture line with a wet cloth. The wound was sealed, though it wasn't a pretty sight. The scar would be jagged, a match for the one on his own face, but it would hold. He covered her with a dry wool blanket, carefully tucking it around her trembling frame. The fire's warmth, the fading pain, or maybe the curious purr of the cat beside her, slowly began to stir her from the depths. The shift was instantaneous. One moment Elias was leaning close, checking her gums for any sign of shock. Valkyrie's amber eyes flew open. The haze of unconsciousness vanished, replaced in a heartbeat by a raw, defensive fury. She had no idea where she was. All she knew was the searing pain, the vulnerability, and a large male figure looming over her pregnant form. A roar, impossibly powerful for her weakened body, tore from her throat as she struck. Her jaws locked onto Elias's forearm. A hot, sharp agony flared up his arm, but the thick wool of the flannel shirt he'd put back on after the work spared his skin from tearing, though the pressure was immense. Barnaby hissed, scrambling away, fur bristled like a cornered porcupine. Valkyrie struggled to her paws, stumbling but defiant, her lips peeling back from gleaming white fangs as a low, menacing growl rumbled deep in her chest. She retreated into the corner, creating a barrier between Elias and the perceived threat to her pups. Her entire being was poised to kill. Yet Elias didn't yell. He didn't reach for his gun. He did not retreat. Adrenaline surged through him, but where panic from his past usually bloomed, there was only a strange crystalline serenity. He understood this aggression. It wasn't born of malice, but of sheer terror. It was the primal reaction of a wounded soldier awakening in a chaotic field hospital, uncertain if the figure looming above was ally or foe. He held his ground, unyielding. The throbbing pain in his arm was a distant echo. He deliberately corrected his posture, his spine locking straight, his shoulders squared. He emanated not a threat, but an aura of absolute, unshakable command. His gaze bored into the snarling animal's eyes. "Stand down, Marine," he commanded. His voice was not loud, but it dropped a full octave, resonating with the tempered steel of a drill instructor and the unwavering calm of a platoon sergeant. It was a tone that bypassed thought and went straight to instinct. Valkyrie froze solid, the growl dying in her throat. Her ears, once pinned back in fury, flicked forward with uncertainty. She blinked, the amber inferno in her eyes, dimming into a haze of confusion. She looked at the man, truly seeing him now. She saw the stance. She heard the tone. She smelled the blood, her blood on his hands, but underneath it the sterile scent of antiseptic. She felt the stitches pulling tight along her flank, the threads that were holding her broken body together. One warrior recognized another. Slowly, with an agonizing grace, the tension bled from her coiled frame. She lowered her head. Her tail gave a single tentative wag, a whisper against the floorboards. Elias remained perfectly still, holding the space for her, letting her process. Valkyrie took a hesitant step forward, favoring her injured side. She approached him, her head bowed in a gesture of surrender. When she finally stood before him, she did not bite. She extended her neck and pressed her cold, wet nose into the hollow of his open palm. Then she gently licked the spot on his forearm, where she had torn his flesh moments before. It was an apology. It was a ceasefire. Elias finally released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding captive. He carefully lowered his hand, his palm coming to rest on her head, his fingers sinking into the thick ruff behind her ears. "At ease, girl," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're safe. The perimeter is secure." Barnaby, sensing the immediate danger had passed, gracefully hopped back onto the arm of the sofa. He looked from the dog to the man, gave a short, sharp meow of what could only be approval, and began to groom his tail. The storm raged relentlessly outside, burying the world in a sea of white. But inside the small fortress, their first alliance had just been sealed. The solitary crack of a hammer striking wood echoed through the desolate, frozen valley. A steady, man-made pulse beating against the wind's fury. Elias stood within the aged shed, a shadow behind the cabin, his own breath a ghostly vapor in the frigid air. For 5 long years, this structure had been a tomb. A heavy iron padlock had kept it sealed, guarding the scent of turpentine and dried oil paint, and the very specter of a life cut tragically short. But today the lock lay broken open on the snow-dusted workbench. This had been Clara's sanctuary. Elias paused, his hand hovering over a half-finished canvas shrouded by a drop cloth. He couldn't bring himself to lift the fabric. He wasn't strong enough for that kind of wound, not yet. Instead, he focused on the room's perimeter. He was carving out new space, moving stacks of forgotten canvases and jars of brushes to high shelves, clearing the floor for plywood and insulation. "It has to be warm," he whispered to the silence, stretching a rusty tape measure across one corner. "Draft-free secure." He was building a whelping box. The cabin was far too cramped for a German shepherd and a litter of pups, especially with a one-eyed cat who considered the floor his own sovereign kingdom. The shed was sturdy, fashioned from the same cedar logs as the main house, but it cried out for reinforcement. Elias worked with a desperate intensity, insulating the walls with fiberglass batting salvaged from the crawl space, sealing the cracks where the wind snaked through like a thief. It was strange work for Hans, a man trained to dismantle rifles and detonate ordnance. And yet with every nail he hammered into the wood, he felt a spark of something he thought long dead since his discharge. Purpose. Not a mission to destroy, but one to build. As late afternoon bled into evening, a radio in the corner crackled, shattering the silence. The forecaster's voice was strained, stripped of all its usual manufactured cheer. "A pressure system is plummeting. We are looking at a historic low. This is not just a snowstorm, folks. This is a bomb cyclone. Expect gusts up to 60 miles per hour and temperatures plummeting to 20 below zero. If you are not home, get there now. If you are home, stay there." Elias glanced through the grimy window. The sky had turned a bruised, violent purple. The trees were already bowing, groaning under the strain of an unseen assault. "Roger that," Elias said to the radio. He gathered his tools. The whelping box was complete, a solid three-walled sanctuary lined with faded blankets. But its purpose would have to wait. Nothing would be sleeping out in the open tonight. He pushed his way back toward the cabin, bracing himself against a wind that fought to throw him from the trail. As he swung open the heavy oak door, the blast of warmth from the wood stove felt like a physical embrace. Inside, the natural order had been upended. Valkyrie was on her feet. The sutures on her flank were holding, though every movement was a study in stiffness. She was no longer resting by the fire. She was patrolling. It was a slow, measured limp from the main door to the back window, then across to the kitchen, and returning to the door once more. Elias knocked the heavy snow from his boots and slid the deadbolt home. A fragile piece. The cabin was sealed tight. The dog froze and fixed her gaze on him, her ears rotating like twin radar dishes. She did not relax. A low growl rumbled in her chest before she turned to resume her watch. She inspected the seal of the window with her wet nose. She pressed an ear to the crack beneath the door, listening. Barnaby was part of the watch, too. The cat had claimed the top of the refrigerator the highest observation post in the room. From his perch, his one good green eye methodically swept the darkened corners of the interior. When Valkyrie passed beneath him, she paused, glancing up. Barnaby looked down, offering a slow, deliberate blink. There was no snarling, no show of dominance. It was a quiet, professional relay of information. "Sector 1 is clear," the cat appeared to signal. "The perimeter is holding," the dog seemed to confirm. Elias observed them as he pulled off his soaking coat. They were an improbable alliance, a wounded canine and a one-eyed feline, yet they were devastatingly effective. They had instinctively divided the responsibilities. Valkyrie controlled the ground floor. Barnaby maintained the high watch. Together, they were covering each other's vulnerabilities. "Do you two need a set of radios?" Elias murmured, pouring fresh water into a bowl for the dog. Valkyrie drank deeply, but then immediately returned to her post at the window, staring into the swirling white void. A profound restlessness gripped her. The sharp drop in barometric pressure was likely causing her old wounds to ache. Or maybe the rising storm resurrected ghosts of other violent, chaotic nights in far-off deserts. As true darkness fell, the tempest collided with the mountain, striking with the force of a barreling freight train. The cabin groaned. The wind had ceased its howling. Now it screamed. A shrill, almost human cry pierced the air. In that instant, the lights wavered. Once, twice, then nothing. The cabin was swallowed by utter darkness. The refrigerator's gentle hum faded away. The electric heaters fell silent with a final click. A profound, weighty silence descended upon the room, only to be immediately overwhelmed by the howling gale outside. The generators were out of fuel. Elias cursed under his breath. He hadn't refueled since the last storm, a careless rookie mistake. Complacency. He navigated the blackness by pure instinct, feeling his way to the mantel for the emergency candles. He struck a match, its sulphurous flare sharp and fleeting, and touched the flame to a wick. A fragile globe of golden light pushed the shadows back, sending them leaping erratically across the log walls. The temperature started its relentless descent almost at once. The cabin was solid, but 20 below was a predatory cold searching for any weakness. It crept in through the floorboards and radiated from the icy window panes. Elias frantically fed the wood stove, cramming it with his driest oak until the cast iron itself began to glow a deep, sullen red. But it would never be enough to warm the back bedroom. The warmth would be confined here to this one room, and even then it would only reach a few feet from the fire's heart. His gaze fell on Valkyrie. She was trembling, a subtle tremor that ran through her powerful shoulders born from the biting cold, the ache of her mending wound, and the tension of the storm. "Can't leave you on the floor tonight," Elias whispered to himself. He moved to the bedroom, pulling the heavy down comforter and thick wool blankets from his own bed. He snatched his pillow, hauling the entire armful into the main room and dropping it onto the braided rug directly before the stove. He shaped the bedding into a makeshift nest. "All right," he said softly. "We're huddling, body heat." He settled onto the blankets. Valkyrie loomed over him, uncertain. In the service, dogs were treated like respected equipment, but they were kept in kennels. Growing up, the dogs slept in the barn. But this was about survival. "Come on." He patted the blanket next to him. "Lie down." Valkyrie circled 3 times, a deep-seated ritual to scan for unseen dangers, before collapsing with a heavy thud, her back pressed securely against Elias's side. A long, groaning sigh escaped her as she finally settled. For a moment, Elias went completely still. He could feel the profound warmth radiating from her immense form, the solid weight of her spine against his ribs. She was guarding his back, literally. Then a soft thump. Barnaby landed on the mattress. The cat walked across Elias's legs, kneading the duvet with his claws, purring like a diesel engine. He didn't choose the foot of the bed. He crawled right up to Elias's chest, curled into a tight orange ball, and tucked his nose under his tail, wedging himself into the crook of Elias's arm. Elias lay there in the flickering candlelight, staring at the ceiling beams. To his left, the fire crackled. Against his back, a warrior dog breathed in a slow, deep rhythm. On his chest, a broken cat vibrated with contentment. For 5 years, Elias had slept alone. He had built a perimeter of ice around his heart, telling himself that solitude was safety, that loving anything meant losing it. He had convinced himself he didn't need touch, didn't need warmth. But as the storm raged outside, trying to tear the world apart, the ice inside him began to fracture. It wasn't a violent break. It was a slow melt. He moved his hand, his fingers brushing against Valky's fur. She didn't pull away. She leaned back harder against him. He rested his other hand on Barnaby's warm flank. Tears hot and unbidden pricked at the corners of his eyes. He didn't wipe them away. "Okay," he whispered into the dark, his voice thick. "We hold the line together." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't dream of sand and blood. He dreamed he was sitting in Clara's studio, the smell of turpentine in the air, watching a sunrise that never ended. The peace of the shared slumber did not last until morning. It was broken at 400 hours, not by the storm, which had reduced to a low, mournful moan outside the cabin walls, but by a sudden, rigid tension in the body pressed against Elias's back. Valkyrie scrambled up from the nest of blankets, a low whine escaping her throat. Elias was awake instantly. The transition from sleep to high alert was seamless. A neurological pathway burned into him by years of sleeping with a rifle in his sleeping bag. He sat up, rubbing the grit from his eyes, the dying embers of the wood stove casting a dull, blood-orange glow across the room. "Report," Elias whispered, his voice raspy. Valkyrie was panting. It wasn't the heat. Her sides were heaving. Her tongue was lolling out as she paced in tight, frantic circles on the braided rug. Suddenly she stopped, her back arching. A wave of contractions rippled visibly down her spine. "It's time," Elias breathed. He felt no panic. He felt only the sharp, cold clarity of a mission. He sprang into action, adding more wood to the stove to raise the room's temperature. He gathered the prepared stack of clean towels and a bottle of iodine. He began to wash his hands, scrubbing them with a relentless focus until they were almost raw. Then he knelt beside the waiting nest of blankets. Barnaby was already keeping vigil. The cat had foregone his usual retreat to higher ground. He sat perched on the edge of the blankets, his one green eye fixed on Valkyrie with an unnerving intensity as if he were calculating the odds. The first puppy arrived 20 minutes later. The delivery was flawless, a textbook case. With a low groan, Valkyrie pushed, and a small, wet sack slid out onto the towels. Elias moved to assist, but she had it completely under control. She tore the amniotic sac with her teeth, severed the cord, and immediately began licking the small creature with a vigorous, life-giving rhythm. "Alpha," Elias whispered gently, checking the pup. "A male, big dark, and with strong lungs." The newborn squirmed and squeaked a sound of protest against the cold world. 30 minutes later, Bravo arrived, another male lighter in color, who battled his way to his mother's side with aggressive determination. Then came Charlie, a little female, smaller than her brothers, but with a spirit that was twice as fierce. Elias sat back on his heels, dragging a hand across his sweaty forehead. 3 healthy puppies. Their mother was exhausted, her breathing heavy and labored, but she dutifully cleaned them, her tail thumping faintly against the floorboards. "Good job, Marine," Elias whispered to her, offering her a bowl of water laced with sugar for energy. "You're doing so good." But the sense of completion was fading. An hour passed. Then, a second hour dragged on. Dawn began to seep like gray ink through the frosted windows, and inside the atmosphere had shifted from relief to a suffocating tension. Valkyrie was straining again. She pushed her entire body, arching in a desperate spasm of effort, but nothing happened. She tried again, and a high, sharp yelp of agony ripped from her throat. It was the sound of something gone terribly wrong. Elias moved closer, his voice low. "Let me see, girl." She didn't growl. She just looked up at him, her eyes wide with exhaustion and raw panic. Her reserves were utterly depleted. As Elias checked her, his heart sank. He could feel the pup stuck fast in the birth canal, terrifyingly still. Something was dreadfully wrong. A breech presentation, or perhaps 2 pups were impossibly trying to emerge at once. Whatever the cause, the way was blocked. "Damn it," Elias hissed under his breath. Valkyrie's contractions were fading. She let her head fall to the blanket, her breathing a shallow, frantic flutter. Her gums were pale as bone. If that pup didn't come out, a deadly infection would surely set in. He would lose them both, mother and pup. "No," Elias said the word, a raw growl. "Not while I'm here." He coated his hand with olive oil he'd grabbed from the kitchen. "I'm going in, Val. This is going to hurt. You cannot bite me." He gently slid his hand inside. Valkyrie shrieked a sound that made every hair on Elias's arms stand on end. She thrashed wildly, trying to pull free. Suddenly, a solid orange weight settled upon Valkyrie's neck, Barnaby's claws carefully sheathed. He pressed his forepaws into the thick fur of her scruff and began to groom her face with an urgent tenderness. He licked her muzzle, her eyes, her ears. He purred with such intensity it sounded like a motor. This was a calculated diversion. He was anchoring her, pulling her mind from the agony in her hips to the gentle ministrations on her face. Valkyrie's thrashing subsided. She focused entirely on the cat. "Good boy, Barnaby." Elias grunted, sweat stinging his eyes. His fingers finally located the pup. It was turned sideways, a transverse lie. A tiny leg was hooked on the pelvic bone. It was a mechanical obstruction. Elias closed his eyes, visualizing the complex anatomy. He had to rotate it, push it back just a fraction, then guide it out. "Push, Valkyrie," Elias urged. "Come on, girl, push." He carefully manipulated the fragile body. He felt a sickening slip, a soft pop, and then the path was clear. With one last heroic push from Valkyrie, the fourth pup slid into Elias's waiting hands. "Delta," Elias breathed. But there was only silence. There was no movement at all. The pup was limp like a wet cloth. It was smaller than the others, its fur a dark, matted sable. Its tiny tongue was blue. Valkyrie lifted her weary head, sniffed the motionless bundle, and let out a low, mournful cry. She was too weak to even clean it. She collapsed back onto the bedding, her ordeal over, leaving the fate of her pup to the medic. Elias went to work. He rubbed the tiny body vigorously with a rough towel. Breathe. Come on, breathe. Nothing. The small chest was utterly still. Elias swept the mucus from the pup's mouth with his pinky finger. He cupped his hands around the delicate muzzle and breathed a gentle puff of air, gentle just enough air to fill the delicate lungs without tearing them. He pressed his thumb against the chest. 1, 2, 3. A breath, 1, 2, 3. "Don't you dare!" Elias pleaded, his voice a raw, trembling whisper. "Don't you dare leave me. I gave you an order to stand down, not to check out entirely." The ghosts of the past swarmed him then, not of canines, but of men. Miller lost in the dust. Henderson silenced in the chopper, the profound stillness of bodies that had ceased their struggle. The crushing futility of forcing life back into a vessel already drained. He rubbed with more urgency. He breathed again. The minutes crawled by. The pup's warmth was fading. Elias froze. His shoulders collapsed. The immense weight of every failure, every fallen brother crashed down upon him in that small, suffocatingly quiet room. He gazed at the tiny, perfect body cradled in his large, scarred hands. It was finished. He bowed his head defeat, closing in, like the storm raging outside. Suddenly, a flash of orange. Barnaby pushed his way insistently between Elias's hands. The cat stared at the limp puppy, then fixed his gaze on Elias, an expression of pure contempt for his surrender etched on his feline face. Barnaby lowered his head, sweeping a coarse, sandpaper tongue over the puppy's face. There was no gentleness in it. He rasped it hard against the pup's nose and mouth. When that failed to work, he lifted a paw and sharply swatted the puppy. A quick bap-bap right on the nose, claws extended just enough to scratch to sting. A shock of pain. The puppy's tiny frame jerked violently. A small, wet sneeze erupted from the blue muzzle. A sputter, then a gasp. Then a thin, high-pitched wail that was the most beautiful music Elias had ever heard. The chest inflated. The pale tongue bloomed into a healthy pink. Delta was fighting. Elias stared utterly dumbfounded, his mouth agape. All the air rushed from his own lungs in a single racking sob that shook him to his very core. He quickly wrapped Delta in a warm, dry towel and nestled him against Valky's belly. The mother roused herself, nudging the newcomer, accepting him into the line. Alpha Bravo Charlie, and now Delta. The squad was finally complete. Elias sagged back onto the floor, leaning heavily against the leg of the sofa. He looked at his hands covered in the visceral fluids of birth and life. He looked over at Barnaby, who was now casually grooming a paw as if he hadn't just performed an impossible miracle. And then the tears came. They did not trickle. They came like a dam bursting apart. Elias pressed his face into his hands and shattered. He cried for Clara. Where? Tears fell for Miller. For the years wasted just waiting for the end. He wept because for the first time in a decade, death itself had come knocking, and he and a one-eyed cat had fiercely denied it entry. The sun finally crested the ridge outside. The storm clouds were in full retreat, surrendering to a sky of searing, brilliant blue. Light streamed through the window, catching dust motes in a slow dance, igniting the golden fur of the slumbering dog, and the fiery orange coat of the cat who stood sentinel. Elias scrubbed his face with a rough sleeve. He was bone-weary. He was a wreck, his leg a dull, throbbing ache, but his gaze fell upon the 4 tiny heartbeats nestled against their mother. And Elias Thorne knew his long war had finally ended. The winter remained, but the fortress was no longer a place of exile. It was finally a home. The sacred silence that once guarded the cabin on the ridge had been shattered, forever broken. In its place, a chaotic and joyous symphony had taken root. 6 weeks had passed since the fury of the storm, and the living room had been transformed from a sterile command post into a boot camp for the beautifully uncoordinated. The squad, as Elias had named them, had grown from blind, helpless creatures into 4 whirlwinds of teeth fur and unending energy. Valkyrie embraced her role as drill sergeant with solemn purpose. She was a mother, but a wolf at heart. She offered no coddling. When Alpha, the largest and most audacious male, dared to steal food from her bowl, a single sharp, guttural bark sent him scrambling backward, tripping over his own enormous paws. She taught them the laws of the pack, not through violence, but with firm, undeniable boundaries. She instructed them in the art of the ambush. Elias watched from his armchair, coffee clutched in hand as Valkyrie would sink low behind the sofa, coiled and waiting. As Bravo and Charlie tumbled past chasing a ball, she would launch herself. She never hurt them. She simply bowled them over, pinning them for a moment with a heavy paw before licking their faces to prove that discipline is a form of love. "Stay sharp," she seemed to say. "The world is full of sudden turns." Barnaby, however, was their professor of soft skills. If Valkyrie was teaching them how to be soldiers, Barnaby was teaching them how to be citizens. The old cat had commandeered the high ground atop the armrest. His lone eye surveyed the unfolding chaos with the profound, detached calm of a seasoned sage. The puppies were utterly captivated by his presence. To their young minds, he was some kind of strange purring canine with the baffling ability to scale curtains. Then, one afternoon, Charlie, the boldest of the litter, decided to confront the enigma and cornered Barnaby. She yapped and pranced, a whirlwind of puppy energy, attempting to start a game by nipping at the tip of his tail. A cat of lesser composure would have answered with claws, but Barnaby remained still, waiting for the perfect moment. As she lunged close, he extended a single paw, claws completely retracted, and delivered a soft, deliberate tap right on her nose. "Boop!" Charlie froze mid-pounce, a look of pure confusion on her face. Barnaby blinked slowly, a gesture of immense patience before he began to gently groom the fur on her head. The message was unmistakable. True authority doesn't come from aggression. A quiet confidence can command an entire room. Yet it was Delta who underwent the most profound transformation. The runt of the litter, the one who had brushed against death and returned, was forever changed. While his brothers and sisters tumbled over a squeaking rubber duck, Delta would sit transfixed by the fireplace, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. He was smaller, his coat a deeper, smoky sable than the others, and he carried a solemn weight that felt ancient and out of place in one so young. He became Barnaby's constant shadow. Wherever the cat moved, Delta would trail behind, desperately trying to imitate the feline's silent, graceful stride. Though his clumsy puppy paws inevitably betrayed him with a soft thump, thump, thump. He never chewed on the furniture as Alpha did. Instead, he had developed an intense fascination with Elias, specifically with Elias's left leg. The deep scars from the shrapnel and the persistent ache were wounds Elias always tried to conceal. But Delta seemed to sense the history etched into that limb. He would drag his small blanket over, arranging it just so before draping himself across it to sleep, Elias's foot resting his small chin on the ankle. It was as if the puppy knew with an instinct beyond understanding that this was the very source of the pain, and he was resolved to anchor it with his own small weight, with a love so pure it might finally silence the hurt. On the desk, the journal lay untouched, collecting a fine layer of dust. Elias no longer needed to write letters to ghosts from his past. He had found a new, living audience. In the quiet of the evenings, as the fire crackled and the puppies melted into a pile of sleeping fur on the rug, Elias would begin to speak. "You know, Alpha," Elias murmured one night, his eyes on the sleeping pup twitching in some forgotten dream. "You remind me of a sergeant I once served with in Okinawa. Loud ate like a beast, but he would carry you 10 miles on his back if you so much as twisted an ankle." His gaze then shifted, finding Delta, who was blinking up at him from his devoted post on Elias's boot. "And you," Elias whispered, leaning closer, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw a sunrise in Kyoto once. Delta, it was so peaceful, much like you. A mist rolled off the mountains and everything was bathed in gold. It had nothing to do with the war back then. It was simply peace. I made a promise to myself I would go back. Maybe we'll all go together." He shared with them the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean, the bold taste of espresso in Rome, the scent of fresh rain in the tropics. He was actively replacing the memories of bloodshed and desert sand with the beauty he had once seen, but failed to truly appreciate. He was rewriting his own past, speaking it into existence for these creatures who listened without judgment. Then the day of the first patrol arrived. The weather had finally cleared, breaking into a crisp, blindingly bright winter day. The snow was piled deep, but a hard crust had formed over the top, solid enough to be walked upon. "All right, squad," Elias announced, shrugging on his heavy coat. "A field trip, move out." He opened the back door, and the reaction was nothing short of explosive. The puppies tumbled out into the stark white world, slipping, sliding, and sneezing as the cold air shocked their noses. Valkyrie instantly snapped to attention, trotting ahead to secure the perimeter of the clearing, her nose testing the wind. Barnaby, determined not to be left out of the expedition, followed closely in Elias's wake, stepping meticulously in the boot prints to keep his underbelly dry. It was a flawless scene. Alpha and Bravo were wrestling playfully in a snowbank. Charlie was digging a frantic hole for no discernible reason. Delta was sitting near Elias, intently watching a crow in a pine tree. Elias leaned on his cane, breathing deeply of the pine-scented air. He felt light. For the first time in ages, he wasn't scanning the tree line for snipers. He was just a man enjoying the sight of his family playing. Complacency is a soldier's most lethal enemy. The threat didn't emerge from the trees. It descended from the sun. A shadow vast and utterly silent swept across the snow. It moved faster than any cloud with a sharpness that cut the wind. Elias looked up, his eyes squinting against the harsh glare. "Valky!" he shouted, his voice cracking with sudden dread. High above, tucking its wings for a terminal dive, was a bald eagle. It was massive, a raptor with a 6-foot wingspan, a true master of the aerial kill, and it wasn't targeting a rabbit. Its focus was locked squarely on Alpha. The puppy remained oblivious, rolling on his back, exposing his soft, vulnerable belly to the sky above. "Alpha, move!" Elias roared. He lunged forward, his shattered leg completely forgotten. He had forgotten about the ice. His injured leg found a treacherous patch of frozen crust and gave way without warning. Pain, searing and all too familiar, shot through his thigh as he went down hard, crashing face first into the cold snow, his cane skittering uselessly out of reach. Valkyrie was a world away, but his cry cut through the silence, and she whirled around, unleashing a desperate warning bark. She threw herself into the deep powder, but the unyielding laws of physics were working against her. The eagle was a guided missile locked on its target. She was a powerful tank mired in mud. Above the eagle flared its massive wings, shattering the still air, its talons deploying like sharpened grappling hooks, zeroing in on the puppy's fragile spine. Alpha glanced up, paralyzed with confusion, as a terrifying shadow suddenly eclipsed the sun. Elias had no time to crawl to his feet. Valkyrie had no time to close the distance. But another unforeseen player was already on the field of battle. From the shelter of a snow-dusted log, an orange blur shot into the sky. Barnaby had no intention of attacking the eagle head-on. A direct assault would have been suicide. Instead, his strategy was one of shock and awe. The little cat launched himself vertically, directly into the eagle's flight path, and from his throat erupted a sound that no house cat should ever be able to produce. It was not a meow, nor was it a hiss. It was a demonic high-frequency shriek, a banshee's wail of pure, unfiltered rage, his small body exploding into a ball of fluff twice its normal size. The eagle, its focus absolute on its canine quarry, was utterly unprepared for a surface-to-air feline missile. The great raptor flinched, banking sharply to the left to evade the screeching orange goblin. Its attack rhythm was shattered, its target lock irrevocably broken. The deadly talons sliced through the snow mere inches from Alpha's head. Barnaby landed on all fours and held his ground. He stood protectively over Alpha, his back arched in defiance, hissing at the vast open sky, challenging the apex predator itself. That single act of courage bought Elias 2 precious seconds. He rolled onto his back, his hand finding the grip of the Colt 1911 tucked in his waistband. He never ventured outside without it. He fired a single round into the sky. Crack. The report echoed off the mountains like a clap of thunder. The eagle understood instantly that the element of surprise was lost, and that its prey was now armed. It pumped its massive wings, fighting for altitude. It climbed swiftly, letting out a screech of pure frustration, circling once more before catching a thermal and gliding away toward the distant peaks. An unnerving silence descended upon the clearing once more, punctuated only by the ragged breathing of a man and his dog. Valkyrie finally reached them, frantically checking on Alpha, nudging him gently with her nose to make certain he wasn't bleeding. Alpha. The chilling realization hit him he was nearly prey. He scrambled for the safety beneath his mother's belly. Elias pushed himself up from the snow, his hand grasping his throbbing leg. His eyes found Barnaby. The cat was perched on the log once more, dispassionately grooming a single snowflake from his paw. He met Elias's gaze, then glanced toward the heavens, letting out a short, dismissive meow. "You magnificent crazy creature." Elias whispered, a laugh finally breaking through, the sound both shaky and profoundly genuine. "You actually took on a dinosaur." Delta cautiously approached Barnaby, sniffing the stoic cat's face, and then gently licked the very top of his head. It was an unmistakable act of pure reverence. The puppy understood what he had just witnessed. His father figure was more than just a mentor. He was a slayer of monsters. Elias gathered them close. "All right, team. RTB. Return to base. The show is over." As they trudged back toward the cabin's warmth, the piercing pain in Elias's leg seemed to dissolve. He watched the small orange cat leading them forward.